The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. The political divide in this country this year has been compared to that of the Civil War era. It is not surprising that the simple act of casting a vote has become intensely partisan and polarized. In this edition of Challenge 2.0, we examine the truth and fiction surrounding voting rights and what that says about the state of our democracy. So on this issue, we're very fortunate to have two very well-informed and insightful guests this week join us on Challenge 2.0. Alyssa Weed from the League of Women Voters, Seattle, King County. Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
And also offering some wonderful insights, Brianne Schuster from American Civil Liberties Union of Washington. Brianne, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, I can't imagine why we'd be picking this as a topic to talk about at this particular time. There's been so much in the news and discussion back and forth. We've heard the president say we need to get rid of the ballots in reference to the upcoming election and refusing to agree, at least publicly, to agree to a peaceful transition. I just have to ask you on a personal basis, what was your reaction when you heard that?
Obviously, it's very troubling. So a safe and fair election coupled with a peaceful transition power is literally what makes our democracy democracy. My concern is that this might deter people from voting if they don't feel like it's important or if it will matter, because not everywhere has election day as easy as we do here in Washington. So if you're thinking about people who need to arrange childcare, take time off of work to go stand in line all day, coupled with, a pandemic, people might not feel like it's worthwhile to do that. So that's kind of my primary concern about that. I don't want to go down the road of thinking there's going to be some mass civil unrest, but obviously everybody needs to be prepared. And I would just encourage folks to not expect election results to be immediately available on election day. There might be some delay. We've got people voting in ways that they've never voted before, just in terms of the mechanics of it. So I think some patience. If you have time to email your local election facilitators just to see what their process is, do some research, educate yourself, but absolutely vote, still vote. It will be counted.
Brianne, I'd ask you the same question. When you heard those statements, what was your reaction?
It's incredibly concerning, deeply concerning. And, those types of statements are really threatening our democracy, right? They're a threat to our democracy. But at the same time, I think what's important for us to remember is that there's a lot of power that we have together, and power in staying true to our values. And, in Washington, we've had mail-in voting for almost a decade, and actually longer than that. And we're used to not receiving our results on election day. And so I would just echo that sentiment that Alyssa shared about we might not know on election day, November. And that doesn't mean that, there's rampant voter fraud or that it's something is awry or amiss. But I think we've seen the power in folks organizing and working together and using all the tools that we have available, from activism to educating ourselves to advancing our laws. And I don't think, regardless of what happens, I don't think people are just going to sit back and accept any erosion of our democracy. So we'll step up and we're going to be prepared for it, and we'll come together.
You've both made reference to mail-in ballots, and there have been considerable attacks on the whole process of mailing in your vote. What is the real situation with that? Both here in Washington state, as you noted, we've had a long history with that, but also elsewhere in the United States.
So I can't speak too much to other places in the US, but so just to give you some numbers, in 2018, there were 142 cases of voter fraud in Washington state where people had cast more than one ballot between different addresses or voted on behalf of a deceased family member. So it's 142 out of 3.2 million. So it's not, perfect, but it's certainly not a major issue. I'm not a math major, but I can tell you right now it's a fraction of a percent. So in reality, we don't have that issue here. And that is a true testament to the work being done at the state and county levels, just to make sure our elections are safe and secure, and that we do have, mechanisms in place to check signatures, to separate ballots from names. It's all pretty secure, at least here in Washington. Overall, we don't hear that much fraud voting by mail. Not to say it doesn't exist, because obviously we had 142 cases, but it's not a major issue that should preclude folks from voting by mail.
That was 142 out of how many ballots cast?
3.2 million.
I just quickly did a calculation, and that would be on the order of about under 1/10,000th of 1%. So it's...
There you go.
Yeah, I think it's pretty incredible that it's a controversial issue. I mean, not only have a number of states had exclusive mail-in ballots, but the vast majority of states allow eligible voters to cast their ballots by mail in certain circumstances, right? We have absentee ballots, we have if you're living abroad. And so that concept is not new, nor are the protections that we've had in place to ensure that voting is secure, that there aren't, that fraud isn't running rampant. And I haven't seen any evidence in those states, in Washington, in Oregon, and other places that have had mail-out ballots to all registered voters, any significant issues of fraud. And as Alyssa alluded to, there's many defenses we have to prevent that. And certainly it's possible, just like it's possible to get, a fraudulent ID, for example, but that doesn't mean we don't issue driver's licenses. There's not evidence of fraud, but there's a lot of benefits to it. And especially right now during a pandemic, it's really essential that people don't have to choose between their voice and their right to vote and their health and staying safe and honestly protecting their lives. So, we think vote by mail is a really sensible solution, and that people need to have that access right now.
And this has bipartisan support in Washington state, does it not?
Our Secretary of State here is a Republican, and we've got a Democrat-controlled legislature and executive branch. So, I mean, we do it, and people work really well together to make sure that we're balancing accessibility with security. And I think that's what's really key, is making sure that, we're not compromising on either, and we're constantly innovating to make sure both of those benchmarks for voting are really met. And as was said just a moment ago, you can't hack a piece of paper. The League believes that voter verifiable paper ballots are the gold standard. Just from a perspective, it helps auditing. You can't hack it. Once the ink is on the paper, the ink's on the paper. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that we do mail-in voting that make it safe and secure, while also making sure people can participate that way.
Just on a personal level, you both elected to go into this area of voting rights and the process of the election. Is this the sort of controversy and these the sorts of issues that drew both of you into that? I'm just curious as to, what generated your interest in this particular area.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In part because, I would say yes and no, because some of the attacks we're seeing, on our electoral system, on democracy, are somewhat unprecedented. So I don't know that I could have necessarily predicted when I went into this work what we would be looking at this moment in time. But that being said, I've always believed in the importance of representation and democracy and the power of a democratic system. That, and like all the other things that go into upholding that and upholding people's civil liberties.
For me, I always grew up in a very political household. And once you kind of have an issue that you're passionate about, you want to know, why doesn't everybody feel the same way as me? How can I talk to people about this. And then you realize people do really care. People have a serious vested interest in their communities and in their families and in their networks. But we haven't successfully yet made that connection between caring about an issue and turning out on election day, right? And it's not because everybody doesn't care, that's part of it, but we've systemically stripped people of their right to vote. We've made it hard for people to vote. We've all contributed to a culture of like, my voice doesn't really matter. I live in a red state, or I live in a blue state, or what do city councils do? And so in activating folks to care about specific issues, we also need to draw the connection between that and voting. So that is kind of how I entered into the sphere of being really passionate about voting rights and access. Kind of for selfish reasons, you know, because I had my views and I wanted to spread them. But when you open up the can of worms of who isn't voting, who is voting, who is at the table, you really get down into these nitty-gritty ways that a lot of folks don't even think about when thinking about access to the ballot.
Yeah, no, I love that, Alyssa. And I think what has been really powerful for me too, and just hearing, you know, about a lot of the reasons why people don't vote, and how it can be, you know, and one of them being like, I'm not seeing anyone that represents my interests. And I think that part of that reason isn't because people are apathetic, and it's not because they don't care about what's happening to them. It's because they legitimately are not seeing people that are representing the communities that they live in. And you know, it was the more that I dug into this work, the more that I realized and learned that that is because of the systems that we have in place, and not because it's not like people just aren't running for office and they don't care about their communities and they don't want to represent them. And so I think that's so important. There's so much work that we need to do to be able to make representation more meaningful.
You both brought this up, but I think I might address this even more directly, and that is outside of the statements that we cited earlier coming out of the White House, out of Washington, what other issues really concern you in terms of voter participation and free and fair elections coming up in just a matter of weeks?
Yeah, I think just any sort of national headline in Washington in particular is so hard to talk about with folks here, because a lot of the stuff going on in the ether doesn't apply to us, but it feels like an emergency. Like it feels like in Washington state, our voting rights are under attack. We won't be able to vote on election day. And I think just the need to reinforce that elections in Washington, we do them by mail every year for at least the last 10 years. For example, I'm 27. I've never voted in person ever. I've only ever voted via mail. So I think just kind of making sure that we are educating people in our community about what their rights as a voter are and what to expect on election day is really important. So yeah, my concern going into election day is really just kind of parsing out what the actual threats in Washington are versus like what the national threats are. And some of that comes from the White House. A lot of that comes from other places. And just kind of seeing what's going down in other states. People get really concerned about what's going on here.
Brianne, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I have all the same concerns that I had for every other election, right? I think, you know, we've seen this mass closure of polling places, of people being purged from voter rolls, challenges to registration, challenges with early voting. And so all of those things are still present in this election, and they're just exacerbated by the pandemic. And so I have all of those issues on my mind. And I think, you know, we have to make sure that states are adequately prepared both to process mail-in ballots and to ensure that people can safely vote in person if needed, right? So there are certainly populations where mail-in voting is not it's just not a feasible solution for them. We definitely need to make it available, but we also need to make sure that you're able to vote, whether it's by mail or in person, but that everyone has the right to cast that ballot. So that's also on my mind. And I think too, hoping, I guess, that people vote down the ballot. So I think there's a ton of emphasis every 4 years on our federal races. But there are so many other races that have just as much of an impact in many ways on our daily lives, right? And I think like our judges, our police officers or sheriffs, our city council, our county commissioners. And so I hope that we can continue engagement at a local level long past this election, because those races are also really critical to people's livelihoods.
As we look at voter participation in past elections, you tend to see that young people are underrepresented. Their participation is not matching other age groups. Number one, is that sense true? And if it is, what insights would you offer in terms of why that's the case and what we can do as a society to go ahead and increase that participation?
Yeah, so when we think about young people, I think the first demographic that comes to mind for a lot of folks is college students, right? And the tricky thing about college students is they often go to school places where they're not registered to vote, and they're not going home to vote. I mean, they can request an absentee ballot, they can have their guardian send them their ballot next day or whatever, but that makes it very challenging when you've got people who are living in a community for 4 or more years and they're not actually part of that community on paper as a voter. So they might not feel connected to they might not feel connected to their hometown where they haven't lived for several years. Young people have less stable housing situations. They might move every year, they might not update their voter registration information. That makes them hard to track down. From a political campaign point of view, if you're not voting in an election, you're not getting mailers, you're not getting ads, you're not getting any sort of interaction from campaigns. Young people typically don't have the capital to be major campaign donors, so they're not getting invited to fundraisers, they're not going to those rallies that are suggested donation $250 a person. They're not going to those things. They're asked to work a campaign, maybe paid minimum wage for their time, but that's it. There's no kind of vested interest in what young people are really interested in. And I'm hoping that changes, because we've seen, I was just talking to somebody the other day. I was like, as a millennial, I've seen, I've never lived in a true peacetime. The environment, like the world is literally on fire. I've now seen 2 major economic collapses. It would be hard to see young people not turn out in this election just because so much has been thrown at us in such a short period of time. So, schools are closed. They can't get an entry-level job. They might be experiencing for the first time a true civil rights movement. Somebody they know may have gotten COVID. These are all factors that can really activate and radicalize people. And so I'm hoping that that really translates on election day and we see people fully make the full circle into voting.
Brianne, what's your perception of that?
Well, I guess I'm technically also considered a young person, but I I really appreciate and like that question. I think just statistically, yes, there's evidence that younger people are not showing up to vote at the same rate, and that's been true since 18-year-olds got the right to vote. So that's not specific to this generation. That's been a trend since kind of the beginning of time. And I guess I would, echo a lot of the things that Alyssa said, in that there are a lot of barriers that everyone faces, right, to registering to vote and to actually voting. And many of those are exacerbated for young people because of their housing situation, because they're in college. I knew a person, for example, who had just moved right before an election to the place in which they wanted to vote. And while Washington has same-day registration, you have to have either an ID or some kind of proof that you live where you say that you live. Mm-hmm. And this person hadn't had a chance yet to get a Washington state ID, nor did they, and it was really challenging for them to kind of provide the proof that they lived at the place that they lived at, because they hadn't gotten bills yet. They hadn't had a lot of whatever proof of residency. So I think that's one thing. I think voting is super important, but it's also not the only way to make your voice heard or work towards advancing change. And so I think one thing that we've seen with young people is there are a lot of ways in which they're advocating for issues they care about. They're organizing, they're protesting, they're engaging in direct action, they're engaging in mutual aid, they're educating their peers. And so they're doing a lot to engage with the political process, even if they're not always, showing up to vote for a particular person. And I think the other thing that I would just name, particularly for federal elections, right, is representation matters, and who is running matters. And for young people, I mean, the average age of a representative, I think in the House is almost 60 years old, if not older. In the Senate, it's over 60. And so when you have an 18-year-old that's looking for somebody that's representing their interests and their needs, like college costs, for example, or the rising cost of housing and unemployment, they're not necessarily seeing people that are talking about the issues that they care about. Climate change, I think, is another one, and prioritizing those in the same way that they're prioritizing them. I think there is evidence of increasing turnout of young people, at least in Washington. I think there will be for this election too, but it's, of course, pure speculation at this point. But I think it's a complicated issue.
Well, you've alluded to this, both of you, but maybe you could summarize by telling us what you and your colleagues for both of your organizations are doing right now to meet some of these challenges, both in terms of young people, but the overall issue of voting rights.
Yeah, so we really ramp up during election season with outreach and educational events. This year they look a little bit different because of COVID, but we're not slowing down. The big thing that we do is we do candidate and issue forums. They're free and public, so you can just tune in. We moderate. We make sure all of the questions are relevant. We try to get people the information that they need so that when they get their ballot, they're ready to rock. The other fun program we do right now is Ballots and Baristas. So we used to have meetings in local independent coffee shops throughout King County where you could come and sit down with a league facilitator and kind of go through the pros and cons of all of the issues on the ballot. So not the candidates, but the ballot measures, as well as the mechanics of voting, what to do if your dog eats your ballot, or if you moved last week and you didn't set up your mail forwarding. So those kind of things. We'll be holding all of those over Zoom now. So we're still chugging along. We've got a texting line it's aimed at young adults so that they can text a phone number and get election information. So we've been laying a lot of groundwork the past couple of years to do a lot of outreach with young people and with new voters, phone banking, writing postcards, those kind of things, because we know that direct voter contact is the easiest way to turn somebody into a voter. It looks different with COVID because we can't go door to door, we can't do canvassing, we can't hold events, we can't have ballot parties, but we can be creative and we can use the tools at our disposal to make sure that folks are educated and empowered and feel comfortable and confident in our system.
I think as we talked a little bit earlier about what the ACLU has been doing has kind of varied based off of the state that the affiliate is in. And so we're super fortunate in Washington to not maybe have to be doing all of the same activities as people in other states. But we're currently, so across the country, we have lawsuits ongoing, not necessarily from this affiliate, but from other affiliates in other states to ensure that people's right to vote's protected. And we're certainly keeping an eye on things too. So if there's a violation, we are preparing for that as well. And then continuing to engage in advocacy. And I think public education and voter education is really critical, as Alyssa was alluding to. So we're also working on circulating materials, doing events, engaging with webinars and online materials, and also kind of adapting and seeing what that looks like during COVID and how we can best reach people and be a resource.
For both of you and both of your organizations, any particular resources or maybe just general contact information that if somebody says, I've listened to Alyssa or Brianne, I'd like to know more about their work, more about the resources, what would you recommend they do to contact or to obtain that information?
Yeah, so for us, seattlelwv.org is our website, but there's also a phenomenal league resource called vote411.org. And that is where you can go wherever you live in the country. It is updated with election information about candidates and ballot issues. And it's all compiled by league members. So there's no spin, there's no partisanship. It really is just like copy paste statements directly from a candidate during an interview with a league member. So if you don't want to parse through a million op-eds or newspaper endorsement things, you just want to know what so-and-so thinks about X, Y, and Z, you can go to Vote 411. There's information on what your local voting laws are, so you're prepared. I highly, highly, highly recommend vote411.org.
Yeah, that's great. We have a voter center. It's aclu-wa.org/vote. And it has also nonpartisan just information about voting generally and a lot of frequently asked questions about registration deadlines, et cetera. The Secretary of State's website also has a lot of that information if folks are looking for it as well. And you can check the status of your registration there as well too. So just making sure that you're registered, and if not, you can register. And we highlighted that on our website too. But I think to make sure your registration is accurate and up to date is super important to do right now.
Well, Brianne and Alyssa, thank you so much. There's so much more we could talk about, not just in terms of this election, but in terms of correcting some of the issues, some of the challenges that are affecting everybody's right to vote, their ability to be informed and to make their voices count. And we are going to be offering a second Challenge 2.0. So while I thank you for this week's edition, we hope you'll join us again next week when we look at the second part of this whole issue of voting rights. Thank you so much for joining us on Challenge 2.0.